I'm sure you have some idea in your head what the proper punishment is when someone or a few people commit murder. There's been a long history of jurisprudence, trials, and decisions as long as humans have been killing other humans. But what happens when it's not one person, but a country, or a political party, or an ideology in and of itself? These were questions largely unaddressed when the Second World War came to an end in 1945. The Allied forces in Europe found themselves occupying Germany, a country which had started the most destructive war in history. Furthermore, the government's dominant party and a popular ideology had committed the most intensive industrialized mass murder in human history. How do you punish that? How do you make sure that the horrors of the nationalist Nazi Party and Nazism itself never resurface? Without much previous legal background, this is what the Allies had to figure out, and how they each accomplished it would guide the fate of two Germanys and the European subcontinent forever. I'm your host David, and today we're going back in chronology a bit to expand further on a topic we've mentioned but didn't talk to in great detail: denazification. This is the Cold War. Just before we start, and so I don't waste some commenters' precious time, the Nazis and Nazism was an irredeemably hateful ideology without redeeming quality. I'm just going to put in the corner here a little gif of US troops blowing up a giant swastika for the rest of the video. Very nice, thank you. Now, let's begin with the Western powers, and with the Allied country who probably took the lightest touch to denazification: France. The French didn't see any purpose in differentiating the Nazi from the average German. From their perspective, all Germans were to blame. So, that being said, their process was less about rooting out Nazis and bringing them to justice as it was trying to change the German culture to stamp out fascist ideologies. They tried, though unsuccessfully due to labor shortages, to find government bureaucrats and teachers who shaped the government and youth into Nazis and purged them from their positions. I can't say for sure why the French were so lenient, only really bringing about 13 Germans to justice in their occupation zone. Some historians suspect it was because many of those in the French government who managed the occupation were left over from the Vichy regime, a puppet government for the Nazis propped up in France during the war. They seemed to not see membership in the Nazi Party as grounds for arrest necessarily, and quickly turned over the process of purification, as they called it, to the Germans. Now, this might seem criminal given all that happened. Still, historian Fred Taylor suggests this leniency was the seed which improved Franco-German relations going forward. Given how friendly they are today, that might have been a big deal. Seriously, the fact that France and Germany have been at peace for so long is actually a bit of a minor political miracle, given what their shared history had been up until 1945. The United Kingdom also had higher priorities than hunting down every last Nazi. Like many European countries, they had been devastated by the war, and London was in deep debt to the United States. So while stopping the ideology that caused this war was excellent and all, they more wanted Germany to get back on its feet so that they would no longer be dependent on the UK. So, for example, they relaxed the restriction on lawyers who were members of the Nazi Party several times, deeming that nominal membership was okay. Instead of firing industrialists who belonged to the Nazi Party, a great source of money as the fascists rose to power, by the way, the British simply countered with labor laws that allowed for powerful unions. To balance out the Nazism, I guess. Many companies operated in Germany during the war, and some used Jewish slave labor. These companies more or less got away with it. BMW, Krupp, Siemens, Porsche, all participants in the Nazi war machine. They did make some efforts, however, to make sure that those who were directly responsible for war crimes were brought to justice. The British used harsh interrogation techniques like torture and starvation to catch anyone who did war crimes. They also used those same techniques on people they thought were communist spies, but that's a different story. right? The Americans, however, took things a bit more seriously. They literally gave each German over 18 a questionnaire asking how much they were involved and associated with the Nazi regime or believed in their ideals. They would then give them categories from major offenders to exonerated persons. They scrutinized membership lists for the Nazi Party, screening the some 1.5 million people who joined before Hitler's rise to power with a particular focus. This was a bureaucratic nightmare in the chaos of post-war Germany. Tabulating this process of vetting an entire zone of occupation required powerful supercomputers, which, although today probably would be less powerful than a simple calculator, weren't particularly common in 1945. By the end of that year, there was a backlog of over 4 million questionnaires for processing. The program was severely under-resourced as troops wanted to go home, and soldiers who read German were a rare commodity. General Eisenhower thought this occupation might need as long as 50 years to complete. But once processed, the punishments were harsh. Any former Nazi was barred from ever holding public office. Some more hardcore members were literally banned from any work except manual labor. Nearly half of government workers were prohibited from working in the public sector, which halted the rebuilding effort and stalled the development of a working government. By 1946, the slow process was decentralized, and local denazification officers instead oversaw tribunals across the American occupation zone. But even that was too slow. Germans were desperate to find ways to make this process move faster. They decided to blanket forgive any German born after 1919, claiming the Nazis had brainwashed them. They tried to loosen regulations and speed up the processing, especially for those on the lower end of the involvement scale, roughly 90% of the caseload. In the end, the denazification project came to be seen as a farce. There was a thriving black market for denazification certificates. It was becoming undeniable that Nazis were falling through the cracks as they desperately looked for more efficiencies to speed up the process. Germans began to turn against the process itself in a pretty big way. After nearly 2 million people lost their rights to work in anything but manual labor jobs, and almost 100,000 Nazis were put in prison, the priorities of the US occupiers began to change. Communism was now being seen as a more significant threat than a resurgent Nazi movement in Germany. They quickly fast-tracked the rest of the process, letting tons of former Nazis fall through the holes they created. West Germany eventually cancelled it entirely in 1951. This wasn't their only project, however. The Americans put in a lot of effort to denazify the population via the media. This meant censoring print publications, radio stations, cinemas, and theaters. They banned any criticism of the Allied forces, as well as anything they deemed too nationalistic or Nazi-friendly. Of course, I would be remiss if I neglected to mention that there was a bunch of Nazi scientists who got to move to America without any consequences so that they could start building rockets. But that's a different video all on its own. Something about paperclips, I believe. Now, in the Soviet occupation zone, denazification was intense. The Soviets, who I will remind you lost 13% of their population in the war, saw crushing Germany's ability to invade Russia, the Soviet Union, as a top priority. Party members weren't processed or categorized. They were immediately arrested and put in internment camps. These camps were run in the exact same system as the infamous gulags. Estimates range from 40 to 80,000 people died in these camps, which ran until 1950. The other project was to remove support for liberal parties as well as fascists. From the perspective of the Soviets, the former was simply a less evolved form of the latter. Oh, and of course, Stalin wanted to make Germany a socialist state to maintain a power base. The same reason the US blanketed Western Europe in Marshall Plan money. Geopolitics. Cold War. The stuff this channel is actually about. In East Germany, it became easy to label all attempts to resist the regime a fascist uprising. As to how accurate that actually was, One of the often undertold stories of denazification in East Germany is taking all that angry Nazi energy and trying to channel it towards socialism. This was the reason for the creation of a satellite party called the National Democratic Party of Germany. It was literally founded by two former SA officers and designed to attract former members of the Wehrmacht and the classes who supported the Nazi party, a sort of socially conservative socialist party. In the end, an idea can never really be crushed out of existence. And so, even after denazification, Nazis continued and still continue to darken our doorways. Nazis who continued to practice their ideology after the war were given the moniker neo-Nazi and are found all over the world. And much more troubling, hate group statistics show them on the rise in the last decade. Even with explicitly anti-Nazi laws, political parties like the AfD in Germany are slowly resurfacing a dark and ugly political movement from history. Nothing ever really ends. So, how does one find justice for a political ideology committing mass murder? We saw 4 different methods, and all of them gave up on the process after a spell. It's probably one for the philosophers or something, and sadly, we here at the Cold War are just historians. But nonetheless, it's a troubling thing to consider that the failure to adequately confront the perpetrators of past crimes has impacted the world we live in today. Denazification was a process which began with the best of intentions, but which was in many cases abandoned for the sake of expediency in not only rebuilding war-torn Germany, but to strengthen new potential allies in the face of the deepening conflict of the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed today's look at denazification, but to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. We rely on your support to continue making these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.